My brothers and sisters, Isaiah 1:10 through 17 chronicles the time before Ezra and Nehemiah when Judah observed the feast, yet in a wrong spirit and with reprehensible conduct. Isaiah preached this to the Jews about 100 years before they went into captivity to Babylon. This is a clear indictment of their spirit and attitude, advancing strong proof of why Yahuwah later said through Ezekiel that Yasharal and Yehuda went into captivity because of idolatry and Sabbath breaking. There is no reason to believe that just because Yahuwah says your new moons and your feasts, they were not the ones he appointed, at least in name. He could rightly call them your feast because their keeping of them was so abominable that they bore no resemblance to his intent in commanding them to be observed. They were completely discordant with his character, as the listing of their sins shows. He calls their giving of offerings, which were part of the spiritual aspects of keeping the feast, vain and trampling his courts. He designates their prayers as an abomination and their keeping of the feast wearying to him. Clearly, he had it up to here with their Sabbath and festival observances. Have we examined our conduct recently in relation to our attitudes, approaches, and expectations for the feast? These verses give an interesting insight into how far the Israelites may have gone in adding to Yahuwah's commands about the new moons. There is a small chance that the new moon in question is the Feast of Trumpets. But if it is not trumpets, it sets up an interesting situation. As the Israelites' ruling class wallowed in wealth, it drifted farther and farther from a true worship of Yahuwah, in practicing some stringent traditions that Yahuwah had nowhere commanded. They had attached their own ideas to his Torah. This strict observance did not at all impress Yahuwah favorably. Totally out of harmony with Yahuwah's aim of justice, running down like water, and righteousness like a mighty stream, they missed the intent of Yahuwah's Torah entirely. He desires mercy and not sacrifice. These verses strongly imply that the Israelites did not conduct business during the new moon. But Yahuwah never commands such a restrictive practice. Clearly, the day was different from common days because of Yahuwah's assignment of special offerings. But in their occasional burst of zeal, the Israelites apparently believed that if the little Yahuwah required of them was good, then more would be better. In theory, it sounds good, but we are given a twofold warning in Deuteronomy 12:32 and Proverbs 30:6 that we should not add to his word. This casts grave doubts on following the Israelitish tradition. It is easy for us to think of the Old Testament as the book of Judaism, and that followers of Mashiach roots are in Judaism. In fact, this idea is readily accepted in the believer's world, but it is not true in the least, except that there are some shared beliefs. If it were true, its modern corollary would be that followers of Mashiach roots are also in paganism, because some of the concepts that pagans have are also shared with believers. That, incidentally, is what one large church has claimed in its writings about the holy days, that they actually derive from paganism. The truth is that Judaism is a corruption of the religion Yahuwah gave to Moses. It too was syncretic, part pagan, part truth, bound together by their own reasoning. In many places, Yahusha corrected and railed against the Sadducees, the scribes, and the Pharisees. He said directly that they had rejected Yahuwah's commandments in order to keep their own traditions. Yahuwah's commandments are in the Old Testament. The Jews' traditions are not, and they are what the Jews lived by. Therefore, how can we say that Judaism came out of the Old Testament? Yahuwah called the people out of Judaism to bring them under Mashiach, just as today Yahuwah is calling people out of a syncretic Christianity in order to bring them into truth, scriptural worship of Mashiach. If Judaism really were Yahuwah's religion, why did he not fix it from within? The period between the testaments, between Malachi and Matthew, covered roughly 400 years in which a great deal took place. The record of Judaism during that time, particularly the history of the high priest, is much like that of the papacy during the Middle Ages. True believers' roots are in the truth of Yahuwah, not only in the Old Testament, but also in the New. Judaism, though, rejects the New Testament, claiming the Old Testament as their book exclusively, and that perception is very strong to all. This world's followers of Mashiach claims the New Testament as its exclusive domain, and virtually and practically ignores the Old Testament. This ties in with Galatians 1:14, where Paul writes about being zealous for the traditions of my fathers, his description of the national religion of Judaism. Yahusha's disciples transgressed the tradition of the elders, not the Torah of Yah. One cannot find a command concerning what they are accused of in Yahuwah's Torah. Notice what Yahusha says happened here. The Pharisees had pushed the Torah of Yahuwah aside. In the same way, the book of Galatians is not talking about the Torah of Yahuwah, but about Judaism. The two are not the same thing. The Pharisees made their first major error in this area of judgment. They had abandoned the proper yardstick for their basis of judgment. As Matthew 15:1-9 shows, they had developed their own traditions that transgressed the Torah of Yahuwah. Their worship had become vain, worthless, as they substituted the doctrines of men for the doctrines of Yahuwah. The Pharisees had lost touch with Yahuwah's instructions, his mind. They leaned on carnal reasoning, which always decided in their favor. Situation ethics ruled rather than the precepts of Yahuwah. They became very harsh in their dealings with the little people, taking advantage of them simply because they could. Shalom.